The red silk blouse I wore that morning had taken me 3 weeks to find. Not because it was designer or rare, but because it needed to say something, loudly but with class. It had to speak before I did. Strong lines, delicate shimmer, an open collar that hinted at confidence without being aggressive. I wore it with black wide-leg slacks and the Ferragamo heels I'd been saving since last year. The effect, I knew, was precise, commanding, elegant, familiar enough not to alarm, but sharp enough not to be dismissed. I'd booked a suite on the 16th floor of the Grand Thalmann Zurich, not because I needed the space, but because I needed control. The hotel was the venue of the long-awaited Devosin Logistics Partner Summit, and I wasn't going to leave anything to chance. Not when we were on the verge of signing the largest set of cooperation agreements in company history, 11 contracts totaling $2.1 billion, and not after 15 years. 15 years of my life I had poured into Davison. No children, no vacations, no long absences. Not even when my father died unexpectedly 5 years ago. I stayed through the board transition meetings because, as they said then, "Diana, you're the only one who understands our partners." I did, and they knew it. My assistant, Mila, knocked at 7:32 a.m. sharp. She handed me the final checklists: room layout, gift bags, translations for the Chinese and Brazilian execs. I skimmed the guest list one more time. 11 names, 11 CEOs, each representing years of negotiations, lunches, trade shows, and after-midnight calls during port strikes. All of it was coming together. I felt it in my bones. I'd had to fight harder this year than ever before, especially after Chris Sorensen was brought in as the new CEO in January. Fast-tracked, 38 years old, MBA from somewhere expensive. That slick, charming way of speaking, where everything sounded like a LinkedIn post. We'd clashed from the start. I still remember our first strategy meeting. I presented my 5-year logistics projection, built from real port data, customs analytics, and projected tariff shifts. He blinked twice, glanced at his watch, and said, "That's great, but have you thought about just Uberizing the entire model?" That was Chris, impressed with the sound of his own ignorance. Still, I played nice. I always played nice, because I didn't get where I was by making enemies too quickly. That would come later. At 9:02 a.m., the elevator doors opened to the conference hall. Mila greeted the first executives as they stepped in. The room looked perfect. My team had laid everything out to perfection. White tulips from Copenhagen, carbon-neutral coffee from Peru, notepads embossed with each partner's company crest. Every chair had a name card, a personalized dossier, and a custom Mont Blanc pen. I didn't want this to be just a signing. I wanted it to feel like the coronation of a new era. The executives arrived one by one, shaking hands, exchanging nods. My presence was acknowledged with warmth and familiarity. Some even hugged me. After all, I had been the common thread across all their partnerships with Davison. Then, at exactly 9:13 a.m., Chris walked in. Late. Deliberately, I suspected. He wore a dark navy suit and that subtle cologne that always smelled like an overpriced Manhattan loft. With him stood Claire. New, blonde. Not unkind, but clearly picked more for optics than experience. Fresh out of Stanford. No logistics background. Just endless energy, bright teeth, and the eagerness of someone who hadn't yet been broken in by this world. I nodded at them both, then turned back to Mr. Halverson of Nord Stream Freight, who had just arrived. "So glad you could make it," I said, handing him his agenda. "I believe you're seated to the right of Ms. Jun from Astara." But before I could finish my sentence, Chris raised his voice just enough for the room to quiet. "Diana." I turned. "Yes?" He smiled. Tight. Rehearsed. "Could I have a quick word, just over here?" Every head turned toward us. My fingers still rested on Halverson's agenda folder. I stepped away, my heels clicking against the marble floor. Claire hovered awkwardly behind him. I noticed she held a fresh copy of the briefing packet, the one I'd assembled down to the final page. Chris leaned in, still loud enough for anyone paying attention to hear. "You're no longer needed." At first, I didn't even understand what he was saying. "I'm sorry? We're going in a new direction," he said, and nodded toward Claire. "Claire will be stepping in for you today." My body didn't move. I just stared at him. "I've asked security to escort you out. We'll ensure your personal items are returned to your room." He wasn't whispering. This was a statement, a message, executed in full public view, a dismissal designed to humiliate. I looked at Claire, who couldn't meet my eyes. I saw the strain in her neck as she tried to maintain composure, as if she hadn't wanted this either, but hadn't had the courage to say no. I looked back toward the table. 11 CEOs, 11 partnerships I had forged, 11 witnesses to my execution. No one moved, no one spoke, except Julian Tran. He tilted his head just slightly. I saw something in his eyes. Not shock, not pity, but calculation. Like a man watching a chessboard and recognizing a blunder. I slowly put down the folder I was holding and straightened my blouse. I could feel the heat rising in my throat. Not from shame, but from restraint. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the briefing packet across the room and ask them all if they knew what Chris had just done. But instead, I smiled. My lips barely parted, but I made sure the smile reached my eyes. "I see," I said. Then I walked toward the door. Calm, poised, each step deliberate. Chris added, "Let's ensure the event continues smoothly. Please don't create a scene." I turned one last time. "I would never be unprofessional," I said, "unlike some." And then I was gone. Security didn't touch me. They didn't need to. I was already halfway to the elevator by the time they caught up. In the hallway, Mila appeared, confused, holding her iPad. "What's going on? Did something happen?" I looked at her, my mouth a thin line. "Everything just happened." Her eyes widened. "Are you fired?" "Worse," I said. "I've been erased." Back in my suite, I poured a glass of still water and sat at the edge of the bed. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because my mind was already shifting gears. This wasn't random. This was calculated. Claire hadn't just taken over the meeting. She was using my materials. The same keynote slides I built. The same contracts I assembled. The same strategy deck I'd spent nights perfecting. Chris hadn't just fired me. He had cannibalized my work and tried to present it as his own. But there was one thing he didn't know. The original deal terms, especially the last-minute clause I added about the coordination platform royalties, had only been communicated through my private email server, not company email. And none of those agreements had been filed with legal yet. They were still sitting in draft format, awaiting my final signature. In other words, if I was out, so were the deals. I picked up my phone and called the one person I knew would answer. Julian Tran. He picked up on the second ring. "I saw," he said before I could speak. "I have the originals," I said. "They haven't seen the final clause structures. If you back me—" "Send them now," he interrupted, "and meet me in 30 minutes. Conference room 4A. I hesitated. "You're still at the venue?" "I didn't leave. I'm not signing anything until we talk." The call ended. I exhaled slowly. The game had begun. They called it a brand refresh, a harmless phrase thrown around in meeting decks with clean gradients and corporate buzzwords. Energizing our future, reimagining global logistics, centering the new economy. But underneath the pastel graphics and HR-approved enthusiasm, I could feel something tightening around me. Something invisible, methodical. Chris had only been CEO for 4 months, but by the end of his first week, he'd already announced a full-scale strategic repositioning. At first, I didn't see it for what it was. I remember the first leadership sync he scheduled, a Tuesday afternoon in February. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows in the executive boardroom, sleeves rolled up, talking to the room like we were college students brainstorming over pizza. "The world's moving faster," he said, pointing at a chart that looked more like an Instagram ad than a logistics report. "We need fresh energy, new faces. Diana, you get what I mean, right?" I blinked, halfway through correcting a flawed customs fee projection on the slide. "New faces?" He smiled. "You've got great instincts, but we need to make sure the brand reflects where we're going, not just where we've been. People don't want to see dusty spreadsheets anymore. They want vision." Dusty spreadsheets. That spreadsheet had been the basis for our third quarter revenue climb. I didn't respond, just adjusted the numbers and sent the corrected version to legal. But that was the moment I felt it. That subtle burn in my gut. The first flicker of a truth I didn't want to face. He was preparing something, and I was in the way. In March, he started making public-facing changes. Suddenly, Claire, previously an intern with a flair for marketing graphics, was promoted to Strategic Brand Operations Lead. Her desk was moved just outside Chris's office. I noticed the shift in his tone, too. He stopped asking me to present during executive briefings. Instead, he'd say things like, "Let's give Claire a shot at this one," or "Let's hear from someone with fresh perspective." Fresh. The word started to hang in the air like a perfume I hadn't chosen. By April, they redesigned the company website. My name, previously listed under Global Strategic Advisors, was gone. When I asked about it, the communications team replied, "We were told to keep only the core leadership displayed." "You're more of an operational figure now." Operational. I built the entire global partnership framework. By May, the weekly exec team huddles began shifting to closed groups. Claire was there. I wasn't. Notes were no longer circulated. My budget reports began bouncing back with vague comments from finance like, "Can you align with new priorities before submission?" And then came the kicker. Chris started telling the international partners that he was streamlining our global interface. One point of contact for all external negotiation. Claire. He said it during a networking event in Amsterdam, while I stood 2 feet away. That night, in my hotel room, I stared at my own reflection in the mirror for what felt like hours. There was a line I hadn't seen before, just beside my right eye. Not deep, but permanent. I wasn't stupid. I knew what was happening. I've watched too many takeovers play out behind polished smiles and internal memos to miss the signs. This wasn't about my performance. It was about visibility, about image. Chris wanted to look like a reformer, a disruptor, and for that narrative to land, he needed a fall guy, or girl. Someone whose quiet competence could be painted as outdated. Someone he could replace with a newer, more photogenic version of the same role. So that when the contracts were signed, he could stand beside Claire and say, "Look at what we achieved." But I also knew something he didn't. He thought the relationships were built through email chains, scheduled Zooms, and champagne galas. But relationships, the real ones, are forged in the quiet trenches. In midnight calls during port seizures. In face-to-face negotiations in Seoul over typhoon damage reimbursements. In missed birthdays and 3 a.m. strategy faxes. I was the one who had flown to Lagos during a dengue outbreak to salvage our African corridor agreement. I was the one who restructured our transit routes in South Asia after the political unrest in 2019. These men and women didn't trust Devosin. They trusted me. So when Chris decided to humiliate me, publicly, demonstratively, he assumed he was removing a piece from the board. But I wasn't a piece, I was the damn table. After the conference room incident, I spent exactly 7 minutes grieving. Then I opened my personal laptop, opened the encrypted vault, and scrolled through the one thing I had been building ever since Chris was appointed. A timeline. Emails, contract drafts, meeting summaries, voice memos from partner discussions, all of it time-stamped and tagged, not just as insurance, but as leverage. If Devosin thought they could sever me from the deals I had structured with a smile and a press release, they were about to learn the real value of institutional memory. I texted Julian Tran again. "Clause 3.4 still stands. Are you ready?" His reply was nearly instant. "I trust you. Let's make it right." Clause 3.4. buried in the draft agreements with each international partner. An optional ethics clause I had discreetly proposed months ago. A clause stating that any major leadership transition impacting the terms of agreement must be communicated and approved by both parties, or risk voiding the deal entirely. Chris had never even seen it. He'd only been focused on the optics, not the substance. And now, the substance was about to strike back. But the real twist wasn't Julian. It was Sophia. Sophia Alvarez, CEO of Pacifica Rail. She called me that afternoon. No pleasantries, just a low voice and a single question. Did they really just remove you mid-meeting? I hesitated. Yes. There was a pause. Then, we'll be withdrawing our participation. Effective immediately, I sat up. Sophia, wait. Don't worry, she said. We'll re-engage, but not through them, only through you. Then she hung up. 3 hours later, 2 more CEOs followed. By the end of the day, 5 of the 11 deals had been formally placed on hold. I didn't have a title anymore, but I still had the room. 6 months before Chris ever stepped foot into the CEO's office, I saw the storm forming on the horizon. It wasn't loud or obvious. No rumors, no scandal. Just a sudden shift in how the board was communicating. More silence. More corporate ambiguity. I'd learned long ago that in our world, silence was never neutral. It was either a calm before opportunity or a quiet warning. I assumed the latter. That's when I began writing what I now call the diplomatic clause. Its official title, buried on page 12 of a 17-page pre-contract draft, was Condition of Consistency in Executive Negotiation. A neutral name, intentionally bland, just technical enough to be overlooked by anyone skimming. But the content was anything but ordinary. It stated clearly, in the event that the primary negotiator, hereafter referred to as the executive coordinator of strategic partnerships, is unilaterally removed from her position or otherwise displaced prior to the formal ratification of the cooperation agreement, all outlined terms shall be considered void. Renegotiation will be required from initial point, under mutual consent of both parties. In simpler terms, if I was taken off the board, the deal came off the table. A complete restart, not a pause, not an adjustment, a full reset. The language was firm but subtle. It didn't scream rebellion. It didn't even sound like resistance. It sounded diplomatic, legal, reasonable. Because when you're setting a trap for someone like Chris, the last thing you want them to feel is threatened. You want them to feel in control. And that's exactly how I sold it. I started with Sophia Alvarez. The hardest one, Pacifica Rail, was known for being risk-averse, and Sophia herself had a reputation for brutal clarity. She didn't tolerate fluff. If I couldn't justify the clause in practical terms, she would walk. No hesitation. We met in Tokyo over soba noodles and a 2-hour window between her flights. You're adding what? She asked, arching an eyebrow. It's a protective measure, I said calmly. For both of us. Her silence demanded more. Look, I continued, your company is about to enter a multi-year, high-leverage cooperation with Devosin. If leadership shifts halfway through, and the new team doesn't understand what we agreed to, who protects your interest? Sophia nodded slowly. So you're asking me to bet on you staying in the picture? No, I said. I'm offering you a guarantee that if I'm removed, you won't be dragged into a contract shaped by people who don't know your needs. That did it. She signed the addendum that evening. Each CEO required a different approach. Julian wanted logic. I gave him market risk projections if negotiations changed hands. Mr. Halverson from Nord Stream? He responded to precedent. I showed him 3 case studies of collapsed logistics partnerships due to executive turnover. With Ms. June from Astara, it was emotional. She had seen too many projects derailed by egotistical CEOs who pushed aside veterans for vanity. This is about honoring stability, I told her. Stability, she repeated, tapping the page with her pen. I like that word. By the end of 3 months, all 11 partners had not only reviewed the clause, but thanked me for including it. They saw it as a sign of respect, a sign that I considered them not just clients, but equals in the process. The last step was slipping it past Chris. That turned out to be easier than I expected. Chris loved appearances. He was obsessed with pitch decks, branding refreshes, and anything that could be tweeted in under 280 characters. By the time the contract draft reached his desk in week 2 of his leadership, he was deep in preparations for the new Davosin brand campaign. When legal sent him the document packet to review, he replied with a single sentence. "Looks great. Send it through for me to e-sign. I'm jumping into a media call." He never opened the attached PDF. And so, on January 18th, 8:03 p.m., I received confirmation from legal that Chris Sorensen had electronically signed all 11 draft cooperation agreements, including the diplomatic clause on page 12 of each. It was done a trap built on civility, buried in ink. I didn't create it out of malice. I created it because I'd seen this happen before, to other women, to older staff, to people who had worked behind the scenes for years, only to be discarded when someone younger, louder, and better dressed showed up. I didn't want revenge. I wanted insulation, protection for the work I'd spent 15 years building. And if Chris chose to remove me, I wanted that action to mean something. And now it had. The moment he humiliated me in front of those 11 CEOs, the moment Claire stepped into my chair and began flipping through a briefing document she hadn't even helped prepare, Chris had triggered the clause. By his own hand, the signatures were already in place. The contracts were already contingent. And the worst part, for him, was that he didn't even realize what he'd done. Yet, the first line of defense was the clause. Elegant, legal, and devastating. The second, it was a ghost in the machine. 3 years ago, I was sitting in my office, the one with the panoramic view of the old port cranes, when I realized something disturbing. The company had grown too comfortable with shortcuts. Contracts were being passed around as editable Word files. Signatures were copy-pasted. Approvals were often retroactive. One time, I even discovered a logistics agreement signed on behalf of a partner who hadn't yet seen the final numbers. I knew I couldn't trust that chaos forever. So I built my own system. At the time, I framed it as a document integrity enhancement protocol, a pilot program, purely optional, for securing critical agreements. In reality, it was my firewall, a security framework embedded into every high-level partnership agreement I touched, that required one final step for a contract to become valid. My personal, encrypted digital signature. No one knew the encryption method but me. Not legal, not IT, not even the partners. It wasn't a simple typed name or stylized signature. It was a physical device, a secure USB key coded with a rotating digital token, connected to a second-layer algorithm that timestamped and authenticated the final approval. Every time I used it, it would leave an invisible watermark inside the document's metadata, and every signature would automatically generate a legal verification report sent to our external law firm in Geneva. And here was the brilliance. If someone attempted to bypass or mimic the signature, it would trigger a silent alarm, a message sent directly to my lawyer, Marla Essen, with a full audit log of the attempt. I'd tested it twice, both times, flawlessly. To everyone else, it looked like a standard signature system. To me, it was an invisible gate. And Chris? He didn't even know it existed. As soon as I left the conference hall that day, the device was in my bag. It always was. I carried it like people carry emergency inhalers or talismans, tucked inside a small leather pouch clipped to the inner lining of my work bag. The code to activate it was never written down. I changed it every month, memorized it like a prayer, because I knew this day would come. Maybe not exactly like this, but close. Chris, I had no doubt, was downstairs right now, smiling his PR smile, trying to rally the shaken CEOs, telling Claire to just stick to the notes, and hoping no one would notice that the strategy she was reading didn't have her fingerprints anywhere on it. And he had no idea that everything they were doing, every word spoken, every handshake attempted, was completely worthless. Because the final signatures were not signed, not legally, not technically, not truthfully. I didn't make a sound as I opened my laptop in the hotel suite. The room was still quiet, the sun sliding across the carpet. From my window, I could see the shadow of the Grand Thalmann's conference annex below, stretched long and useless. I opened the secure vault. Each contract file was there, untouched. 11 of them, each time-stamped, each missing one final mark, mine. I leaned back, took a sip of water, and thought, he's going to try. Chris would likely pressure legal to push the final versions through. He'd assume I'd signed off before leaving. And when someone in contracts realized the validation report hadn't come through, he'd try to override it. That's when it would happen. Sure enough, 26 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It wasn't a call. It was the lawyer alert. I opened the secure message. Unauthorized digital signature attempt detected at 1438. File: Global Cooperation Master Pact.pdf. Source IP: Davosen Zurich HQ. Auto-forwarded to compliance and litigation. I smiled slowly. He'd walked right into it. That signature protocol had a secondary benefit. It was legally recognized across multiple jurisdictions. The Geneva office had helped me file the framework as part of a proprietary data protection initiative back when the EU tightened compliance laws. The encryption method was patented under my name, not Davosen's. That meant any attempt to force a false signature through was not only invalid, it was legally actionable. By trying to push the deal through without me, Chris had effectively committed a breach. Not just internal policy, but international contract law. And every partner, from Sofia Alvarez to Julian Tran, would be informed of the violation within the hour. The phone rang. This time I answered. "Diana, it's Chris." His voice was calm. Too calm. "I'm guessing there's been some sort of miscommunication." I said nothing. "I'm hearing something about signature validation protocols," he continued, tone light, as though discussing a technical glitch. "The team's a little confused. Your process wasn't exactly standard, so—" "It was documented," I said, "and legal approved it 3 years ago." "Well, yes, but we're in a different phase now. I've decided to—" "You don't decide anything anymore, Chris." Silence. "You triggered a legal alert," I continued. "The firm has already notified the compliance board. You attempted to validate agreements using my credentials without my authorization. That's not confusion. That's fraud. Let's not get dramatic. Are the CEOs still in the room with you?" Another pause. "Yes." "Good," I said. "You might want to tell them they flew here for nothing." And I hung up. I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. Because there was still more to do. I opened the shared encrypted contact sheet, the one only I had access to. One by one, I began sending a personalized message to each of the 11 partners. Each note was crafted in the exact tone and language I had used when building the original clause. Not panicked, not angry, just honest and clear. As per the contingency clause discussed during our draft negotiations, the agreements are now void due to a change in executive representation. I regret the disruption and will follow up directly within 24 hours to clarify next steps and possible renegotiation routes. Diana. Within 40 minutes, I had 7 replies. All supportive, all patient, all waiting. Chris could parade Claire around in 1,000 meetings. He could send out press releases. He could hold champagne flutes and flash his perfect teeth at the camera. But without the clause, and without the signature, he had nothing. It wasn't the kind of silence that follows applause or tension. It was the kind that creeps in when something important has gone missing. And everyone feels it, but no one knows quite what to say. Diana was gone. Claire had taken her seat, smiling too brightly, holding the folder with both hands like it might collapse without her grip. Chris stood at the head of the table, radiating artificial ease, one hand in his pocket, the other gesturing toward the projection screen behind him. The Davosen logo shimmered in high definition, but no one was looking at the screen. They were watching him, and they were watching her empty chair. The air in the room was suddenly unfamiliar. The measured calm Diana had cultivated, the mutual respect, the cadence, the balance, had evaporated. What was left was the low buzz of confusion, of distrust, of restraint. Sofia Alvarez was the first to lean back in her chair. Not much, just enough. Her fingers moved over the contract folder without opening it. She didn't speak, but her expression changed. Not angry, not dramatic, just unreadable, as if a wall had gone up. Chris didn't notice. "Now," he said, "let's continue with the walkthrough of the final logistics clauses. Claire, if you'd guide us through Section 6, the harmonized coordination channels." Claire cleared her throat. "Yes, so as you'll see on page 8, under regional pathway realignments, we've—" "Excuse me," Julian Tran said. Claire froze. Chris turned, caught off guard by the interruption. Julian looked up slowly. "Which version of the port arbitration terms are included in this draft?" Claire blinked. I believe the March version?" Julian didn't move. "That's not what Diana and I finalized." Chris stepped in. "Julian, I can assure you all previous terms were integrated." "With her approval?" Julian asked. Chris hesitated. "They were finalized internally." That word, internally, landed with a thud. Sofia Alvarez reached for her fountain pen and, with a quiet but definitive motion, clicked it closed. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Across the table, Mr. Halverson from Nord Stream adjusted his glasses, leaned forward, and folded the contract in half. Not with frustration, but with finality. Deliberate. Like someone closing the cover of a book they didn't intend to finish. Chris was still smiling, but his eyes had started to dart, left, then right, scanning the room for support. None came. Ms. June from Astara gently pushed her chair back. "I have a question," she said. "Clause 3.4. It refers to a continuity condition. Was that affected by the recent change in executive coordination?" Claire glanced at Chris. Chris looked at Claire. Then he said, "We've assessed that the clause doesn't alter the validity of the agreement." Ms. June gave a polite, very slow nod. "I see." Then she closed her folder too. One by one, the dominoes began to fall. No shouting, no protest. Just a silent, shared understanding among professionals who had all come to the same conclusion. They were being handled, not respected. Without Diana, the architecture of trust had crumbled. Chris tried to pivot. "We're still aligned on all strategic goals," he said quickly, voice tightening. "And I'm confident our revised executive approach will streamline the process further." But his words fell flat. They floated in the air for a second too long before being ignored altogether. Julian stood first, then Sofia, then Halverson. No one looked angry, no one looked surprised. It was worse than that. They looked done. As they left, Julian stopped by the door and turned just slightly, his eyes meeting Chris's for a single second. Then he said, "It's not the deal that's broken, Chris. It's the trust." And he walked out. What Chris didn't understand, what he never understood, was that Diana hadn't needed to raise her voice. She didn't need revenge speeches or theatrical gestures. Her departure from the room had done more damage than any scandal ever could. Because it wasn't just a power move. It was a vacuum. A silence that exposed what had always been true. The deal had never been about Devoson. It had always been about her. And now that she was gone, the rest of them finally realized the truth. There was no deal. Not anymore. It began with Oslo. Officially, their representative was Thomas Aberg, head of external trade development, and the kind of man who chose every word as if it might one day be reviewed in court. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. When he stood up from his seat, he did it slowly, with the steady poise of someone who had waited long enough for an answer and finally accepted that none was coming. Chris was mid-sentence, something about synergy and growth mindset, when Thomas quietly tapped his knuckles against the table and said, "In accordance with the diplomatic clause reviewed and accepted on February 17th, Oslo will be formally withdrawing from this agreement." No pause. No negotiation, just a fact. Chris's mouth froze open mid-word. Thomas tucked the contract folder into his leather briefcase and left behind one item: the silver Mont Blanc pen that Diana had selected for each delegate. He placed it carefully on the table, parallel to the placard with his name. Then he nodded once to the room and walked out. Diana saw it from the side of the room, just beyond the curtain, where she stood near a tall ficus plant, neither hidden nor revealed. Her presence wasn't a secret, but it wasn't an announcement either. She was simply there, watching. Chris didn't acknowledge her. He couldn't afford to. Not now. He turned instead to Sao Paulo's delegation, trying to recover. "I think we can all agree that was premature. These documents represent a year of collaboration, and we'd—" But Carolina Silva was already standing. The Brazilian delegation moved with a quiet precision that almost felt ceremonial. Carolina didn't speak at first. She merely removed the Oslo pen from her own folder, the exact same model, and laid it across her closed document. Then she looked directly at Chris and said, "We regret that the terms of negotiation have been violated. Our participation is suspended pending full executive restoration." No explanation needed. Everyone in the room knew what executive restoration meant. It meant Diana. And Diana was not at the table, not anymore. Carolina didn't look at Diana as she passed, but she slowed just slightly, not out of hesitation, but acknowledgement. The same unspoken message the others would soon carry. We know who built this. We know who was betrayed. Next came Singapore. Then Munich. Within minutes, the polished rhythm of the meeting was shattered beyond repair. Each delegation followed their own ritual. Some quietly closed folders. Some left without a word. One left behind a white card with nothing but a single signature, Diana's, from a previous draft version. A subtle reminder of who they had trusted. Chris stood frozen at the head of the table, trying to manage the optics, but it was impossible. The chairs were emptying. The cameras were still. Even the catering staff, sensing the shift, had stepped back behind the partition wall, unsure if the espresso machine should keep running. Claire, still seated beside the main screen, stared at the documents in front of her, not touching them. She looked like someone sitting at the dinner table after the guests had left. The plates full, the conversation gone. And still, Diana didn't move. She didn't need to, because this was no longer about her presence. It was about her absence. And her absence was doing something extraordinary. It was restoring the memory of the room, the memory of the long nights she had spent crafting this summit, the delicate phrasing of every clause, the cultural nuances she had explained over hours of phone calls, the trust, not built in marketing pitches, but in years of consistency. The room remembered her, and it had decided the last to leave was Julian Tran. He took his time. Chris tried one last effort. He stepped toward him, abandoning the podium, voice low but sharp. "Julian, come on. We can talk about this. We'll make adjustments. Bring in new terms. You'll be part of the design process." Julian stared at him a long moment, then glanced once, only once, at Diana. Then he looked back at Chris and said, "There are some designs that can't be salvaged. You just have to start over." He placed his pen down with quiet dignity and followed the others out. When the door finally closed and the room was silent once again, Chris looked around as if waking from a trance. Every chair was empty. Every deal was void. Diana stepped forward then. Only a few feet, not to gloat, not to lecture, just enough for him to see her, fully, clearly. He met her eyes, tired, beaten. "You've just undone 12 months of work," he said. "No," she said calmly. "You did." She didn't wait for a response. She simply turned and walked out, not like someone escaping ruin, but like someone walking home after finally locking the door behind her. The quietest kind of collapse isn't the one with broken glass or raised voices. It's the one where everything looks intact on the outside, even as the foundations crumble below. That's what was happening now. On the top floor of the Davison Logistics headquarters, amid polished glass walls and filtered natural light, Chris Sorensen was experiencing the unraveling of his authority in real time, and the walls weren't making a sound. He hadn't even sat down since the last of the partners had left. Julian's words, "It's not the deal that's broken, it's the trust," echoed like a slow heartbeat, over and over. Claire was seated next to him, silent and motionless, her hands resting lightly on a stack of untouched folders. The Davison brand logo was still projected across the digital screen. The room was still clean, pristine, but it no longer felt like a conference hall. It felt like a tomb. Chris stared at the phone in his hand. Legal had been dodging him all morning, but now they were finally calling back. His thumb trembled as he hit answer. He stepped away from Claire, lowering his voice, as if whispering would somehow alter the tone of the conversation. "Tell me we still have a way forward," he said immediately. "Tell me these contracts can still be honored." On the other end, a pause. Then the voice of Alaric Gaines, lead counsel at the Geneva law firm that had advised DeVosin for over a decade. "Mr. Sorensen, you are aware of Clause 14, I presume?" Chris clenched his jaw. "We were advised that clause was non-binding without final signature." "It is non-binding precisely because it was never finalized," Alaric said, his voice clear, unshaken. "And it cannot be finalized without the digital authentication protocol implemented by Ms. Molnar. That authentication was never submitted. The system logs confirm it. The encrypted key has not been accessed. The agreements are therefore invalid." Chris's hand went to his forehead. "There has to be a workaround. There has to be—" "Any attempt to simulate or override the digital signature will constitute legal fraud under the International Contract Security Act you yourself reapproved in January. As counsel, I must advise you that any such attempt will immediately trigger audit proceedings, both internally and at the international regulatory level. Do I need to explain the implications of that?" Chris was silent. "There is no way forward through the documents as they stand," Alaric continued, almost gently. "The moment Ms. Molnar was removed from her position, Clause 14 was triggered. The only path to renewal would be to renegotiate each agreement from scratch, with her direct involvement, should the partners agree." Chris closed his eyes. He didn't thank the man, didn't even say goodbye. He ended the call with a deadened thumb press, and then, slowly, he sat. The weight of it, not just the failure, but the publicness of it, pressed down on him all at once. This wasn't just a loss. This was an implosion, a personal humiliation witnessed by international stakeholders and soon to be whispered through every boardroom across the continent. Claire didn't speak. She just looked at the screen in front of her. A small pop-up was blinking in the corner. Reuters. DeVosin CEO loses $2.1 billion deal after sudden executive firing. Another alert buzzed through the internal messaging platform. Sofia Alvarez, statement. Pacificra Rail confirms it is no longer engaged in formal partnership with DeVosin Logistics. Instability in management compromises the integrity of strategic cooperation. And then, Julian Tran, Fleet Corps. Fleet Corps has suspended all external initiatives with DeVosin until further notice. Chris looked up, dazed. The very word he had once tossed at Diana in his first month, freshness, now mocked him in its echo. Freshness had nothing to do with power. It was stability that made deals possible, trust, reputation, and he had stripped all three in less than a year. Downstairs, the building was beginning to thin out, not dramatically, not like a fire drill, just slowly, organically. Employees finishing their coffees, not going back upstairs. Analysts slipping phones into bags and stepping toward the elevator without looking up. The PR team quietly gathered near the reception, speaking in hushed tones. Everyone had heard by now. The summit hadn't just failed, it had been undone. Claire, now pale and wordless, closed her laptop and stood. Her departure wasn't a protest. It was a resignation without a letter. Chris didn't stop her. There was nothing left to say. Diana, meanwhile, had descended 2 floors below. Not to hide. She wasn't avoiding the fallout. She just didn't need to stand there and watch it burn. That wasn't her style. That was never her goal. From the polished lounge on the mezzanine floor, she could see a sliver of the conference room through the windowed corridor. Chris was pacing again. Alone now. The remaining staff had retreated, the room now echoing with the dull clink of water glasses and abandoned pens. She looked down at the leather pouch in her hand, the same one that had held her digital signature key all along. The zipper was still closed. She hadn't even touched it today. The contracts had never been signed. The deals had never been made, because she had known this moment might come, and she had planned for it. She didn't need to smile, didn't need to celebrate. There was no thrill in watching someone destroy themselves, just a quiet confirmation of something she had spent years learning. Trust, once broken, doesn't scream. It simply vanishes. She turned away from the window. Outside, the sun had begun to cast long, sharp shadows across the plaza. The reflection of the glass building flickered on the pavement as pedestrians passed without noticing anything unusual. The world hadn't changed. Just one man's illusion of control had. She pressed the elevator button, her coat draped over one arm. The ride down was slow, serene. Her phone buzzed again, but she let it sit in her bag, untouched. She already knew what the messages would say. Invitations, clarifications, offers. At the ground floor, the receptionist looked up from his desk. "Ms. Molnar," he said, standing instinctively. "No need," she replied gently, nodding once. "I'm just passing through." And she was. She walked out of the building like someone who had simply finished a meeting and was moving on to the next. No triumph in her step, no bitterness, only clarity. As she passed the front plaza, two members of the Norwegian delegation were speaking softly by the fountains, reviewing something on a tablet. They looked up. One of them nodded. Not ceremonially, just respectfully. She nodded back. It was over, not the project, not the future. Just this chapter. The one where Chris believed he could replace experience with style, loyalty with slogans, substance with slogans. She kept walking. The building was behind her now. She didn't glance back. Not once. Diana walked steadily, her heels clicking gently along the smooth stone pavers, as if the last 4 hours hadn't shattered $2.1 billion in negotiations. She passed a narrow row of trees planted in silver planters, the wind catching slightly in the leaves. The sun had shifted just enough to throw a sharp line across the street, where cabs and sleek sedans rolled by, unbothered by the implosion behind her. For the first time in a long while, she didn't have a meeting to rush to, no calls waiting for her to jump back into control. And yet, control found her anyway. Her phone buzzed once in her bag. She didn't check it immediately. She let it hum once, twice, almost like a small knock at the door. Then she reached for it. International number, unlisted. Tokyo area code. She paused for half a breath, then answered with her usual calm. "Diana Molnar." "Ms. Molnar," the voice said. "This is Takahashi." Her pace slowed, but she didn't stop walking. "Mr. Takahashi," she replied, her voice level. "I wasn't expecting a call so soon." "You stood up," he said without preamble, and within 20 minutes, every major delegation followed. "I saw it live." South, he had been watching. The video feed had been private, shared only with top-tier stakeholders and legal partners. She should have known he'd be in the background, observing without interference, as he always did, like a chess master reading body language as much as strategy. He continued, "They did not walk out because they were confused. They walked out because you were gone. There is no clearer message than that." Diana didn't reply. "This situation," Takahashi went on, "has exposed a weakness, and also an opportunity." The wind brushed lightly against her shoulder as she crossed into a quieter side street lined with upscale boutiques and bistros. The clatter of kitchenware echoed faintly in the distance. She stepped beneath a white canopy, taking refuge under a line of trees. "I am currently restructuring my International Strategic Council," he said. "I want to offer you a role. Independent, not affiliated with Devosin or any other institution. Diana blinked. In what capacity? Strategic advisor, Takahashi said, with cross-border authority. Asia-Pacific Corridor oversight. Full signature rights, final say on all high-level negotiations. You choose your team. You approve every draft. No internal interference. She leaned against the railing, processing. That's a substantial offer. I'm not finished, he said. Your compensation would exceed your Davison base threefold. Additional equity considerations can be structured at your discretion, and we would not expect exclusivity. You're free to consult elsewhere, if you choose. This time, Diana allowed herself a slow inhale. That wasn't just a return. That was sovereignty. I'll want everything in writing, she said finally, and I'll have my legal team review it before the end of the week. Takahashi didn't hesitate. Of course, you've earned that and more. Then, without ceremony, he ended the call. She barely had time to lock her screen before it buzzed again. A new call, this time a number from Munich. She smiled faintly. Hendrik Vollmer. The man moved fast. She expected nothing less. Diana, he said as soon as she answered. We've both had better days, I'm sure. But I'd say you're having the better one now. Depends on your metric, she said dryly. He laughed. Mine is simple. Control a pause. Let me be direct, Hendrik said. I'm forming a private consortium, multinational, entirely independent of Devosin. We'll be launching a new logistics architecture in under 9 months. But we won't do it without a capable head. I want you at the top. She lifted an eyebrow. As what exactly? Lead strategist, chief negotiator, whatever title you want. You write the charter, we'll make it law. No oversight committee, no interim directors. And the compensation? I'll beat Takahashi's number. Diana actually chuckled. You don't know what Takahashi offered. I don't need to. You wouldn't take his call if it wasn't serious. And I don't lose talent to Tokyo. That last part sounded less like ego and more like policy. Still, Diana didn't answer immediately. What are your conditions? She asked instead. Hendrik's voice lowered slightly. That you never go back to Davison, not even for a ceremonial offer. What happened today was strategic malpractice, and frankly, I don't want your name within 50 meters of their mess. You rebuild with us, not beside them. She considered it. Send a draft, full terms. I'll reply by end of week. You'll hear from my office within the hour. He ended the call just as suddenly. Diana didn't move from her spot under the awning. Her phone was still warm in her hand when a third buzz landed. This time, not a call, but a message. No name, no intro, just a line of text from a secure sender. Baltic Corridor re-entry possible. Final condition, Molnar negotiates. No Diana, no signature. No flourish, no fluff, just a demand. The kind that echoed across billions in shipping, infrastructure, and energy. She didn't even have to respond. The implication was clear. The deal didn't exist without her. Diana stood very still. It had been less than an hour since she'd walked out of the building. Not even that, since Chris had likely begun his desperate spin cycle, drafting PR narratives, calling analysts, praying the media didn't catch wind of what had just happened. And here she was. 3 offers. 3 power shifts, and none of them asking her to apply or wait or prove herself. They were asking for her, specifically, unambiguously. The woman they'd tried to erase was now the hinge point for international cooperation. She began walking again, not toward anything urgent, just into the rhythm of the city. She passed a pastry shop, a young couple on electric bikes, a man in a suit yelling into his AirPods about freight times. The world kept moving, as always, unaware that its corridors of power had just quietly realigned themselves around a woman most had never seen coming. She glanced up toward the skyline, the silhouette of the Davison headquarters still visible between 2 towers. Let them keep the building. She didn't need a floor anymore. She was the foundation. Diana arrived at her new office at 7:12 a.m. It was still quiet in the building, the city barely awake. A soft early light poured in through the windows, spilling long shadows over the conference table that still smelled of varnish and lacquer. The floors had been laid last week. The walls were fresh, a calming gray with bare frames waiting for credentials and future headlines. The room felt unfinished in the most promising way. Not lacking, just beginning. She placed her bag down, opened the wide windows, and for a moment, just a moment, stood completely still. The silence wasn't empty. It was earned. For the first time in almost 2 decades, she wasn't showing up on behalf of someone else. There was no badge clipped to her blazer, no corporate logo printed on her files, no one watching her from a corner office wondering if she'd outgrown her lane. She had no lane now, only direction. 2 months ago, she was running logistics strategy for a company that had forgotten why they hired her. 2 weeks ago, she was silently sabotaged in front of 11 CEOs and forced out of her own meeting. And now? Now she held the title of founder and principal negotiator of Strategic Interlink, a private, high-level advisory and coordination initiative built not on corporate funding or internal promotions, but on personal reputation. Every signature she needed had come not from boardroom votes, but direct requests. People wanted her, not a proxy, not her team, her. The most telling part? No one had asked her to pitch. They came to her. She was reviewing the early drafts for the European trade backbone, a joint effort spearheaded by Munich, Vienna, and Madrid, when the door opened quietly. "Ms. Molnar," Nora said, standing with her usual poise, tablet in hand. "Mr. Woolmer is here." Diana looked up from her notes and nodded. "Let him in." A moment later, Hendrik Woolmer entered the room. No entourage, no preamble, just a dark folder in one hand and the confident air of a man who had made decisions no one else dared to. He extended the folder toward her without a word. She took it and opened the cover. The top page was dense with formality, but the title was clear, black on white, bold at the top. Strategic Framework for the Pan-European Freight, Accord. Lead Architect, Diana Molnar. The breath she took in wasn't for drama. It was for reality. Her name. Not on a footnote, not below a logo. The name. The first name. The deciding name. Beneath it were 10 signatures, a coalition of transport leaders, logistics infrastructure investors, and 2 former Devosin partners. All of them aligned. All of them signaling the same thing. They didn't want the company. They wanted her. Hendrik stood silently as she flipped through the document. Julian Tron's ink was clean and deliberate. Sofia Alvarez had signed with her usual looping flourish, a woman who negotiated like a diplomat but moved like a storm. Even Thomas Aberg, the Norwegian Stoic who once resisted multilateral governance, had marked the bottom corner with a firm black signature. Diana looked up at Hendrik. "No edits?" she asked. He smiled. "Only the title page. We bumped you to the top." Everyone agreed. She raised an eyebrow. "Everyone? Sophia said she wouldn't sign unless your name came first." "And Julian?" He laughed and said, "Diana should be the name on the room, not just in it." She closed the folder slowly. This wasn't gratitude they were showing her. It was recognition. There was no hidden clause, no backdoor replacement plan, no one waiting to take her seat, because this time the seat was hers, designed for her, held up by agreements she herself had architected. There was no higher authority waiting to pull a lever above her head. She was the authority. They walked into the central meeting room. It wasn't grand. A long oak table, 12 ergonomic chairs, a projector that still hadn't been mounted. But the energy in the room felt different. Real. Present. Not the performative stiffness of corporate decorum, but something quieter and sharper. Intention. As the early members of her advisory circle began arriving, Marla from Geneva, the Singapore liaison, Takahashi's senior assistant from Tokyo, even a junior analyst from Warsaw, who had once shadowed her during a rail audit in 2018. Diana saw the same look on every face: respect without fear, confidence without politics, loyalty without contract. They weren't here because of hierarchy. They were here because they believed in the work, and because they trusted the one leading it. Diana didn't sit immediately. She walked slowly around the table as conversations softened, then quieted. Her hand brushed lightly across the chair at the head, the one that had always been reserved for someone else in the companies she'd worked for. Someone younger. Someone with the right last name. Someone with the right stock options. But today, there was no one else. She pulled the chair back and sat down, and no one blinked, because that's exactly where she belonged. The meeting began with a single line from her. Status updates. Quiet room. Let's move. No one hesitated. Marla outlined the status of Baltic Corridor legal compliance. Hendrik introduced the new terminal cooperation models proposed by Madrid. The Singapore delegation presented a digital ledger prototype for customs transparency, and every few minutes, eyes returned to Diana. Not because she was talking the most, she wasn't, but because she was the reason they were talking at all. By noon, the outlines of 3 new agreements were ready for review. By 2 p.m., Diana had made 4 calls, not to executives, but to port managers, ground-level logistics teams, and cross-border infrastructure leads. The people who made systems work. The people she had never forgotten, even when boardrooms did. She didn't need filters or flattery. She spoke clearly. And they listened. Because the name Diana Molnar now carried weight. Not from legacy or branding, but from proven power. When the room finally broke for the day, and people began to trickle out, Hendrik lingered behind. He placed his hand lightly on the back of one of the chairs and looked at her across the table. "You've done it," he said. Diana leaned back, pen still in hand. "No," she replied. "We're doing it." He smiled, but it didn't hide the reverence. "You know they'll come after you," he added. "Not just Davison, the ones who thought this structure couldn't be built without an empire behind it." "I don't need an empire," she said simply. "I have partnerships." And that, she knew, was the real threat, because people didn't fear hierarchy anymore. They feared alignment without them. And Diana Molnar had just built an entire operational alliance with no corporate overlords, no inherited structure, no board to bow to, just vision. And her name on the title page. There was only one item on the table: a black Mont Blanc pen. The same model Diana had ordered for every CEO at the summit in Windsor. The same pen Hendrik Woolmer had left behind. Not dropped, not forgotten, but placed deliberately on the polished wood table that morning when the deal collapsed. She recognized it immediately. She had chosen those pens herself, not just for appearance, though their design had always appealed to her, clean and minimal, weighty without being pretentious, but for what they meant. Finality, intention, signature. When Hendrik had placed his on the table weeks ago, it was a quiet statement. Not rage, not threat, just the last page of a book no one wanted to finish without her. Now it was back, lying perfectly aligned across a fresh document that bore the seal of the newly formed Pan-European Freight Accord. The signature page was blank, except for her line. Her name already printed, waiting only for ink. Across from her, Hendrik stood with that familiar stillness of his, one hand in his jacket pocket, the other resting gently on the back of a nearby chair. He didn't rush her, didn't speak immediately. When she looked up, he offered a quiet nod. "I thought it was time this found its way home." Diana looked down again at the pen. It wasn't the same exact one, of course, but it was that one. The same design, the same balance, the same message, once a symbol of withdrawal, now returned as recognition. "Why give it back?" she asked softly. Hendrik moved forward just a step. "Because this," he said, motioning to the signature line, "only works when someone keeps the deal honest. That was you. It's always been you." And the pen, it belongs to the person who understands what a signature actually means. He didn't need to say anything else. She reached out and picked it up. The familiar weight settled into her fingers effortlessly, as if it had been there the whole time. She didn't twirl it, didn't test the ink, just clicked it once, then lowered it gently to the paper. Her name flowed onto the line without hesitation. No shakiness, no second thoughts, no ghost of Chris Sorensen in her periphery. Because this wasn't about Chris anymore. He had been a moment. This was a movement. She didn't need him to lose in order to win. His downfall, as predictable as it had been, was irrelevant now. That chapter had closed not when the summit fell apart, but the moment she walked out with her integrity intact. Now she was writing a new one. As she lifted the pen, Hendrik reached into his coat pocket again, pulling out a slim leather case. He placed it on the table, beside her signed contract. This is for you, not for the team, not for the archive, just for you. She opened it. Inside was the original copy of the Pan-European Accord Charter. Not the digital draft, not the edit-tracked version passed around through inboxes, but the real, embossed, watermarked original. Her name, again, was on the cover. She didn't ask how he'd gotten it printed so quickly. She knew him well enough by now to understand that some people didn't wait for outcomes. They anticipated them. "You built this," Hendrik said, watching her reaction. "Not as a negotiator, not as a piece of someone else's machinery, but as a creator. You didn't just return, you redesigned the playing field." Diana set the pen down gently atop the folder. There was no rush to close it. The moment needed space. Outside the window, the skyline was soft with mid-afternoon light. The street buzzed faintly below. People going to meetings, crossing sidewalks, sipping espresso from paper cups, completely unaware that just above them, in a quiet corner office, the axis of their industries had shifted. Diana watched a woman hail a cab, her scarf lifting in the breeze. A young man laughed into his phone at the curb. Life moving, uncaring, as it always did. But Diana didn't feel like she was watching it from the sidelines anymore. She was inside the movement now. Not a passenger, not even a driver. The architect. "I don't think I've said this yet," Hendrik said behind her. She turned. "Congratulations." She smiled. Not politely, not out of reflex, but fully. "Thank you," she said, "but I'm not done." He grinned. "That's the best part." Then, with his usual grace, he nodded once, gathered his coat, and left her alone in the room. She stood in silence for a long moment after. Her fingers brushed again across the signed page. Her name, not a placeholder, not a line in someone else's story, but a statement. Diana Molnar, strategic lead, final authority, architect. She closed the folder, slid the pen into her jacket pocket, and stood, not in triumph, but in alignment. Victory, she realized, wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong or even being proved right. It was about clarity, about stepping into the space you built with your own hands and knowing no one could take it away. Not anymore. Chris would become a footnote. The boardroom politics would fade. And soon, even Devosen's name would blur under the weight of irrelevance. But hers, it was just getting started.